The window in my study looks out over the side yard, where the grass slopes down toward a line of old oak trees. A few days ago, I sat in my leather chair and watched my three grandchildren playing out there. They were running in circles, inventing some game with completely incomprehensible rules, their voices carrying through the thick glass of the window. I watched them for a long time. I watched the way they moved, the endless, effortless energy of youth, the way their minds could build entire, invisible worlds in the space of a few seconds. It is a beautiful thing to witness. But as I sat there, holding a cooling mug of tea, a very different, much darker thought crept into my mind. I thought about an old colleague of mine named Thomas. Thomas and I worked together in publishing for nearly 20 years. He was one of the sharpest, most articulate men I ever knew. He could remember the specific details of a contract he had not looked at in a decade. But when Thomas turned 72, something shifted. It started with misplaced keys, which happens to all of us. Then it was forgotten names. And then, one afternoon when we were having lunch, he looked at me across the table, and for about 10 agonizing seconds, he had absolutely no idea who I was. I saw the panic in his eyes before he managed to cover it up. That moment haunted me. It still haunts me. Thomas physically lived for another 8 years after that lunch. But the man I knew was gone long before his heart stopped beating. The slow, quiet erasure of his mind was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. Watching my grandchildren play in the yard, I felt a sudden, gripping fear that one day I might look out the window and not know their names. I realized that keeping my body strong, keeping my joints from aching and my heart pumping, would mean absolutely nothing if the architecture of my mind collapsed. That fear drove me back to my notebooks. It drove me back to the heavy medical journals and the complicated research papers that I spend my mornings trying to decipher. I needed to understand what happens to the human brain as it ages, and more importantly, I needed to know if there was a way to defend it. What I uncovered during those weeks of reading completely changed my understanding of neurodegeneration. But it also did something else. It brought me right back to the very same biological mechanisms that I had been studying regarding cancer and cellular mutations. I discovered that the slow decay of the brain and the rapid, chaotic growth of rogue cancer cells are not completely separate tragedies. They are often fueled by the exact same toxic environment inside the body. And the defense against both of them comes down to the specific, deliberate choices we make when we put food into our mouths. Now, before I go any further, I need to address something. If you have listened to me before, you know that I am a strong advocate for the fasting window. I have spoken at length about how I stopped grazing throughout the day. I have told you that eating 5 or 6 small meals is a terrible idea because it keeps your insulin levels constantly elevated, acting like a biological fertilizer for disease. And I stand by that entirely. For the vast majority of my days, I eat 2 substantial meals, and I close the kitchen in between. But I am also a practical man. I am 77 years old. There are days when I spend 4 hours in the garden wrestling with heavy bags of soil. There are days when the gap between lunch and dinner is simply too wide, and my body sends a genuine, undeniable signal that it requires resources. On those specific days, I need a bridge. But I had to completely redefine what that bridge looked like. The food industry has hijacked the word snack. When we hear that word, we immediately think of something in a crinkly plastic wrapper. We think of highly processed carbohydrates, refined sugars, and artificial flavors designed to give us a quick spike of energy, followed by a debilitating crash. I realized that if I was going to eat something between meals, it could not be a recreational activity. It had to be a tactical intervention. It could not just be something that filled my stomach without spiking my insulin. It had to be something that actively went to work defending my biology. I spent weeks searching for the right tools. I cross-referenced studies on oncology with papers on cognitive decline. I was looking for overlapping defense mechanisms. I was looking for foods that possessed the unique ability to simultaneously starve rogue, fermenting cells while providing profound structural protection to the neurons in the brain. It was a difficult search because the noise in the nutritional world is deafening. But eventually, the science narrowed my focus down to 3 very specific things: 3 things that I now keep in glass jars in my pantry. 3 things that I eat with absolute intention when my body requires a bridge. The first item in my pantry is something that has been part of the human diet for thousands of years, but we have largely forgotten its true value. I am talking about raw walnuts. When I first read the literature on walnuts, I was struck by a peculiar detail. If you take a walnut out of its shell and look at it closely, it looks remarkably like a miniature human brain. It has 2 hemispheres. It has folds and wrinkles. My son Daniel, the engineer, told me it was just a structural coincidence of nature. But the more I read, the more I began to think it was nature giving us a very clear hint. The human brain is primarily made of fat. It requires highly specific types of fats to maintain the integrity of its cell walls and to facilitate the lightning-fast electrical signals that make up our thoughts and memories. The problem with aging is that the brain is highly susceptible to oxidative stress and inflammation. It is like a delicate electrical grid that slowly begins to rust over decades of use. This rust, this chronic neuroinflammation, is what ultimately leads to the cognitive decline I saw in my friend Thomas. What I discovered is that walnuts contain an exceptionally high concentration of a specific type of omega-3 fatty acid called ALA. But they do not just contain fat. They are packed with a unique matrix of polyphenols that possess a rare ability. Many of the antioxidants we consume cannot actually reach the brain because of a protective shield called the blood-brain barrier. But the specific compounds in walnuts are capable of crossing that barrier. When they get into the brain tissue, they act like a biological rust remover. They actively seek out and neutralize the oxidative stress that destroys neurons. But it goes deeper than that. I found papers discussing a specific protein in the brain with a long name, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The researchers just called it BDNF. My daughter Rebecca explained it to me in simple terms. She said to think of BDNF as Miracle-Gro for the brain. It is the chemical that encourages the growth of new neurons and strengthens the connections between the ones you already have. As we get older, our natural production of BDNF drops significantly. The research I read showed that the regular consumption of raw walnuts actively stimulates the production of this vital protein. And the most elegant part of this is how it relates to cancer defense. Rogue cells, as I have mentioned in the past, require massive amounts of glucose to ferment because their internal engines are broken. They thrive in an environment of high blood sugar and high insulin. Walnuts, despite being incredibly calorie-dense and satisfying, have almost zero impact on your blood sugar. When I eat a handful of them, my insulin remains completely flat. I am delivering high-grade structural fat and profound anti-inflammatory compounds directly to my brain without giving a single microscopic tumor cell the glucose fuel or the insulin fertilizer it needs to grow. But I have to be very specific about this. I am not talking about the walnuts you buy in the snack aisle that have been roasted in cheap seed oils and covered in salt or sugar. The heat of the roasting process oxidizes the delicate fats, turning a profound medicine into a source of inflammation. I only eat them completely raw. The taste is earthy, slightly bitter, and completely unadorned. It took me a little while to get used to it, but now, the slow, deliberate crunch of a raw walnut feels like I am physically fortifying my own mind. The second jar in my pantry holds something completely different. It holds something small, dark, and intensely concentrated. I am talking about wild blueberries. Now, I have to make a very clear distinction here. I am not talking about the large, watery, pale blueberries you usually see in the plastic clamshells at the grocery store. Those have been bred for size and sugar content. They are essentially little bags of sugar water. I am talking about the tiny, dark, almost black wild blueberries. I usually buy them frozen because they are harvested at the peak of their nutritional density. My journey to understanding the wild blueberry started with my research into cancer, specifically the process of angiogenesis. I have talked before about how a rogue tumor cannot grow beyond the size of a pinhead unless it tricks the body into building new blood vessels to supply it with nutrients. It needs a dedicated highway. The medical journals I was reading kept pointing to a specific class of compounds called anthocyanins as powerful natural angiogenesis inhibitors. Anthocyanins are the biological pigments that give certain plants their deep red, purple, and blue colors. They are essentially the plant's own immune system, designed to protect it from harsh environments and radiation. Wild blueberries possess one of the highest concentrations of anthocyanins found in nature. When I read the clinical data, I was astounded. The researchers found that these specific compounds actively interfere with the chemical signals that tumors use to demand new blood vessels. When you introduce these anthocyanins into your bloodstream, they act like roadblocks. They cut the supply lines. They force the rogue cells to remain isolated and starved, making them vulnerable to your body's natural cleanup processes. But what truly cemented the wild blueberry as my second daily tool was what happens when those same anthocyanins reach the brain. I found a longitudinal study that tracked older adults over several years. The researchers were looking at memory and cognitive function. The results were not subtle. The participants who consumed wild blueberries regularly demonstrated a significant delay in cognitive aging. The mechanism is fascinating. The anthocyanins cross the blood-brain barrier and physically accumulate in the regions of the brain responsible for memory and learning, specifically the hippocampus. Once there, they improve the signaling between neurons and protect the existing cells from toxic buildup. I do not eat a massive bowl of them. Remember, they do contain natural sugars, and I am highly protective of my insulin levels. I take about half a cup of the frozen wild berries, and I let them thaw in a small glass bowl. I eat them slowly, one by one. They are intensely tart, complex, and deeply flavorful. It is not a dessert. It is a targeted delivery of chemical defense. I am simultaneously starving the microscopic anomalies in my tissues and clearing the communication lines in my brain. I want to take a brief pause here. As I sit in this study and share these quiet discoveries with you, I am always aware that many of the people listening have not yet subscribed to the channel. Daniel regularly checks the analytics, and he reminds me that a large portion of our audience watches every video without clicking that button. If these deep dives into the mechanics of aging are providing you with value, if they are making you rethink your own daily habits, please take a second to subscribe. It is a simple action that allows us to keep this space alive and free from the frantic noise of the internet. I deeply appreciate your support. The third and final item in my specific bridge protocol is something I used to throw away every October when we carved pumpkins with the children. It is raw pumpkin seeds, also known as pepitas. Finding the right third tool was difficult. I already had the healthy fats from the walnuts and the powerful antioxidants from the blueberries. I needed something that addressed the fundamental structural repair of the cells. I needed something that supported the immune system's ability to act as a relentless building inspector. As I read deeper into the biology of aging, I kept encountering references to a specific mineral that becomes increasingly deficient as we cross into our 60s and 70s. That mineral is zinc. Most people only think of zinc when they feel a cold coming on, and they buy those chalky lozenges at the pharmacy. But zinc is not just a temporary immune booster. It is a fundamental structural component required for over 300 different enzymatic reactions in the human body. But the most critical role zinc plays, the one that made me go out and buy a large bag of raw pumpkin seeds, is its function in DNA repair. Every single day, your DNA suffers microscopic damage from environmental toxins, stress, and just the normal metabolic processes of living. In a healthy body, zinc is utilized by specific proteins to identify that damage and repair the DNA sequence before the cell divides. If you are deficient in zinc, the repair process fails. The cell divides with broken instructions. This is the exact genesis of a cellular mutation. This is how cancer begins. Furthermore, the immune cells that patrol your body, looking for rogue cells to eliminate, require substantial amounts of zinc to function properly. Without it, your internal radar goes blind. The building inspector goes to sleep on the job. The research showed me that older adults are notoriously deficient in zinc, not necessarily because they do not eat it, but because our aging digestive systems become less efficient at absorbing it. Raw pumpkin seeds are one of nature's most concentrated, bioavailable sources of zinc. But they also bring something else to the table that is vital for brain health. They are incredibly rich in magnesium. I learned that magnesium is the mineral responsible for calming the nervous system. It acts as the biological brake pedal for the brain. In aging brains, the neurons can sometimes become hyperactive and overstimulated, which leads to toxic buildup and eventual cell death. Magnesium prevents this overstimulation. It protects the neurons from burning themselves out. Just like the walnuts, I only eat the pumpkin seeds completely raw. No roasting, no salt, no added oils. I take a small handful and I chew them thoroughly. They have a dense, satisfying crunch that immediately signals the brain that substantial nutrients have arrived. Because they are mostly protein and healthy fats, they cause absolutely zero spike in my blood sugar. My insulin remains quiet and flat. These are my three tools: raw walnuts, frozen wild blueberries, raw pumpkin seeds. I do not mix them into a sugary granola. I do not bake them into a muffin. I do not blend them into a massive smoothie that destroys their fiber matrix. I keep them in their distinct whole forms. When I have one of those days where the physical demands of the garden or the mental fatigue of reading requires a bridge between my two main meals, I walk into the kitchen. I do not open the refrigerator. I do not look in the cupboards where the processed foods used to live. I take a small plate and I put a dozen raw walnuts on it. I add a half cup of the dark frozen blueberries. I add a small handful of the green pumpkin seeds. I take that plate back to my leather chair in the study. I do not eat them while looking at a screen or reading a newspaper. I eat them slowly, deliberately. I think about the omega-3 fats traveling to my hippocampus. I think about the anthocyanins cutting the supply lines to any microscopic anomalies trying to take root in my tissues. I think about the zinc repairing the broken rungs of my DNA. It is not just a snack. It is an act of biological defiance. Eleanor has watched me develop this routine over the last few years. At first, she thought I was being overly rigid. She still enjoyed a piece of toast or a sweet biscuit in the afternoon. But she also saw the changes in me. She saw that the afternoon fog that used to settle over my mind never arrived anymore. She saw that my energy levels remained perfectly stable from the moment I woke up until the moment I went to bed. Slowly, without me ever pressing the issue, she started joining me. Now, on the days when the grandkids are visiting and the house is full of noise and chaos, she will quietly prepare 2 small plates with the walnuts, the blueberries, and the seeds. We sit together for 10 minutes, fortifying ourselves before returning to the fray. There is a profound peace that comes with understanding your own machinery. For decades, I was frightened of disease because it felt random. It felt like a dark lottery that you could not control. And while it is true that we cannot control everything, while genetics and environment play massive roles that we cannot entirely mitigate, we are not helpless. We are not just passengers on a sinking ship. The food industry wants you to believe that snacking is a harmless, necessary part of the human experience. They want you to believe that you need their processed bars and their fortified cereals to keep your energy up. They are selling you the very fuel and fertilizer that will eventually break you down. You have to step outside of that narrative. You have to realize that every time you chew and swallow, you are sending complex chemical instructions to your brain and your immune system. I often think about my friend Thomas. I think about the brilliant mind that was slowly suffocated by inflammation and oxidative stress. I cannot change what happened to him. We did not know then what we know now. The science was not available to us in the publishing offices of the 1990s. We were operating in the dark, doing the best we could with flawed information. But I am not in the dark anymore, and neither are you. You have the ability to look at a raw walnut and understand exactly what it does to the rust in your brain. You have the ability to look at a wild blueberry and understand how it starves the things that want to harm you. You have the ability to use food not as entertainment, not as a distraction from boredom, but as a precise, powerful tool for survival. The house is quiet again. The grandchildren have gone home. Eleanor is in the kitchen preparing our dinner. I am going to close my notebooks for the day. I feel clear-headed. I feel strong. I feel like a man who intends to know his grandchildren's names for a very, very long time. Tomorrow you will face the same choices. You will feel that afternoon dip in energy. You will hear the pantry calling to you with the promise of quick, easy carbohydrates. When that moment comes, I want you to remember the architecture of your brain. I want you to remember the quiet defense mechanisms waiting to be activated. Choose the raw tools. Choose the things that build you up without feeding the enemy. I hope you find the discipline to protect the mind and the body you have been given. I will see you next time.